Jason is asking, has anyone used Rhino or Grasshopper for MEP? If so, what are some examples? Ehsan, Scott, have you guys seen any MEP integration of Rhino or Grasshopper or Rhino inside Revit?
So we have a Rhino, basically a forum endpoint on the Rhino forums for Rhino inside Revit specifically. So every once in a while, there's a couple of questions about like getting some ductwork modeled and stuff like that. I don't know off the top of my head if somebody has made an introduction or a video specifically for MEP stuff, but it's definitely one of those things that we get questions about.
Omar has a really good question. Many of us, if not all of us, have transferred a lot of our information over to BIM 360. Utilizing cloud sources. Obviously a lot of us are working from home or wherever we might be. So are there any caveats when utilizing families, models, links stored on BIM 360, I guess utilizing Rhino inside Revit?
So one of the things to know about BIM 360 is that it's generally a cloud storage space for Revit models. So as long as you have the model loaded in Revit, just like the local model you have, the information about the model is inside your memory, inside your machine's memory. So Rhino inside Revit can completely freely play with those models, just like it can play with local models. It actually, the way like BIM 360 works is that it caches the cloud model to your machine. So it's really a local model. And then all the linked and stuff are also synchronized using the Autodesk desktop connector. So those are also local models. And we have components that you can interrogate and inspect the linked models that are attached to a document that you're working with. You can actually interrogate those linked models, get walls and elements and stuff like that queried from a linked model as well, if you want to. So we have a pretty good support for the different platforms that Rhino and Revit can store its models, and also anything that's linked to it, basically.
Somebody's asking, confirming Rhino Inside only works with Rhino 6 and 7.
So Rhino Inside depends on a new piece of technology that's introduced in Rhino 7. It's not going to work with Rhino 6. The Rhino 7, the developers for Rhino 7 sort of like took apart a good piece of Rhino and put it back together in a different way. So it could be embedded in other applications as well as sort of like an add-on. Rhino Inside Revit was built on this technology that's available in Rhino 7. It's really asking Rhino to load itself inside the Revit environment, and it also launches Grasshopper. And this Rhino Inside Revit piece that we talk about is really the add-on for Revit that sort of like can talk to the installed Rhino that you have on the machine, get it to load inside Revit, load Grasshopper, and it also adds all these components that Scott showed you. These are the components that come as sort of like packaged with Rhino inside Revit to be able to support Revit workflows inside Grasshopper.
Yeah, and we joke about it all the time, but there's a little secret. The little secret is that Rhino actually is Rhino inside Rhino. It calls itself to load itself. So what's nice is that all the technology we're using for Rhino Inside in Revit is something that we use ourselves for Rhino, and so it allows it to get tested and all that kind of stuff, and keeps it up to date, which is really nice.
There's another question then about work sharing that Dan is asking. These same work sharing rules apply. One of the, as like Scott showed you, our focus is really with Rhino inside Revit is to be able to build as many components and workflows that would support creating and querying native geometry in Revit. So the goal is not to sort of like bring all these crazy shapes and geometries and stuff like that inside Revit that Revit really doesn't understand. The goal is to be able to give you the amazing Grasshopper and Rhino geometry engine that sort of like exists outside of Revit, bring it inside the Revit environment so you can use this visual programming language and the geometry engine to generate a lot of the content that you need inside Revit automatically, all the walls, levels, floors, and all that kind of stuff. As an example, theoretically, you can have a Grasshopper definition that will set up a new project for you. Let's say you work in a company and you want to set up a Grasshopper definition that every time you, I don't know, start an office project or something like that, it'll ask you a couple of questions about the levels and about the number of sheets or arrangements and all that kind of stuff. And it would fully customize the template Revit model that you started with to sort of like prepare the project for you. This is just an example of like how it could be used in the real world. You could use it as, if you're an architect, you could use it as a design tool. You can use Grasshopper inside Rhino without Revit to design any sort of like, let's say you're designing a very complex shell for your building and stuff like that. Grasshopper is extremely popular in free-form architectural design. This RhinoInsideRevit bridges the gap between those sort of like workflows and Revit. So now you can open the same definition that you had inside Grasshopper in RhinoInsideRevit, see your full Rhino model in Rhino, and then add a couple of Revit native components in there that would translate and sort of like bring that into the Revit environment the way you want it to be. So these are like a couple of examples that make it super powerful. But because of this native geometry and all that basically stuff that Revit knows what they're about, everything else about them, phasing, design options, work sets, everything else works just the usual, just like usual. When you create some content using RhinoInsideRevit in Revit and synchronize that with everybody else that is using the Revit model in the other side of the world that they don't have RhinoInsideRevit, there is no conflicts. It's just Revit content that you're sharing. So there's no problem sort of like working with everybody else that don't have RhinoInsideRevit. It's not going to make your models dependent on the add-on.
Looks like there's a question from Victor. Are there any core apps like Elefront that are recommended within the Grasshopper environment?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, Scott. That's a question for you.
Yeah, I can take that. So we're finding that there are certain plugins that are really useful, and so Elefront's one of them. And the reason Elefront is useful is that it gives you the ability to filter and add attributes, additional attributes, key value pairs to Revit or to Rhino objects. And so what it allows you to do is you can actually take information from Revit and attach it to the objects in Rhino, or you can take the objects in Rhino that have additional information, and you can actually make those parameters in Revit. And so it gives you that geometry and data combo in Rhino that you're used to in Revit. And so I think that's where Elefront's been really useful in its ability to actually be able to manage that data in Rhino in the same way that you might use it in Revit. And so it allows, one of the things we found is that the designers are actually, making a lot of decisions about the what the material might be, how things are put together, what the index numbers might be, things early on in the model, in the LOD 200. They're making a lot of decisions. And now with Elefront, they can embed that information in the Rhino model. And then when it's ready, kind of starts working with Revit, all that information get transferred. So you don't lose that information. So Elefront's one of those things that works really well. Another one that we're seeing a lot of mileage with is paneling tools. So paneling tools allows you to take poly surfaces or very complex shapes and break them down into grids or rationalize the shape like you want. It goes far beyond just UV of a surface like you can do in most products. And so paneling tools is a really, really great product or plugin that we're seeing very popular. Another thing, of course, everything in Grasshopper, all the plugins run in Revit. So we can go on and on about this. Another place is Human UI. So Human UI allows you to create custom dialog box interfaces using Grasshopper. And you can, with the Grasshopper player, you can run those and only the dialog box pops up. So you can make interfaces that don't involve Grasshopper at all in terms of the user interface piece. But as you input those things into custom dialog box, then it would generate the object in Revit. So they're just three ones that we'd probably recommend looking out for, in terms of they have been really useful for Rhino inside Revit.
Dana, sorry, I'm jumping in. There are a couple of really
I love it.
there are a couple of really good questions coming in that I kind of want to address. I'm going back to Dan's sort of like question and something to think about, which is the relationships that are formed between Revit elements, like hosting. Like if you have an element that's hosting on somebody else, on some another element. What I generally like to advise. These relationships, obviously, somebody creates a wall and you use Rhino inside Revit to place a few instances of, I don't know, let's say fixtures and stuff like that on that wall, and the original walls gets changed by the original user, it's going to affect the content that you have, just like normal Revit. My generic advice is that always, if you have relationships between Revit elements, bring that relationship logic into your Grasshopper definition. So place that wall using that Grasshopper definition and place the rest of the stuff on the wall on the Grasshopper definition. This way, every time you make changes, the whole relationship and the models and everything else gets generated. That was one. And then there is another question about the add-ons that Scott extensively talked about. Pretty much everything that works with Rhino and Grasshopper works inside Revit now. There's a question that kind of might cause a little bit of trouble here is that, like, what are the key functions that Rhino inside Revit has that Dynamo doesn't? Whenever this question comes up, I prefer to talk about things that that Grasshopper and Rhino have that are sort of like unique, and they're kind of very well known for what they, for these properties. There are 4 of them that I usually list. Rhino is very intuitive and easy to use. It's a generic modeling application, so you can model anything you want. Specifically, Rhino 7, the new version, supports subdivision modeling, which is a free-form kind of like parametric, fully accurate mathematical surface modeling, which is pretty amazing. So that I don't know any other architecture package that allows you to use subdivision modeling. This effectively brings the power of subdivision inside the architecture design. The Rhino's geometry engine is the second one, which is an incredibly powerful, fast geometry engine that you can do anything you want with. I do this often, that I grab something from Revit, take it to Rhino, do all the cuts or whatever that I want to do, or analysis that I want to do on the geometry, because Rhino has all this stuff built into the geometry engine, and specifically the Rhino command, which is its API. So you can access all the Rhino's functionality through its API. This is sort of like, Rhino is so well built that pretty much everything that you see in Rhino's user interface is using the API that's accessible to you to do whatever it needs to do. That's number 2. 3 is Grasshopper as a visual programming environment, which is insanely popular. It's very beautifully designed, very intuitive to use. It has a scripted components and everything else. So it's by far, to me, at least, it's a lot easier to use than the comparable products. And the 4th one is Rhino's support of many different file formats, over 40 plus file formats that you can support. All of those are accessible to Revit now. You can import those models from anybody else that's coming inside Rhino and use Grasshopper and the Rhino inside Revit to translate all this geometry into Revit the way you want to. One of them specifically is Rhino's original file format, which is 3DM. 3DM is an open file format. So unlike Revit file formats, that if you don't have Revit, you don't have access to your data, 3DM is not like this. If you don't have Rhino, you have plenty of powerful libraries and stuff like that that you can read and write this open 3D file format. There are even like, web-based viewers for this, for the content and stuff. So if you store this and like 5 years from now, you still need those geometries, you will have access to those, to that information freely.
And anything that you can share in terms of things that are coming out that you guys are working on at McNeil that maybe we can look forward to? Oh yeah.
So Scott, should I talk about the element binding?
Well, I was going to talk about, yeah, well, how about I'll do the geometry, you can do element binding. We'll do that. So something that just came out, well, there's 2 things that came out just last week and this week. So one is As some of you may know, it's like walking on eggshells when you're trying to load plugin in Revit. So it's, there's conflicts between plugins and things like that. And we've been working very hard to be nice enough that we don't conflict with other plugins. And so last week we actually released a new build that's been a lot better. So anybody that's tried it in the past and had trouble with it loading last week's build, download that, and that'll help a lot. The next thing that we released just earlier last week, and we have another build probably coming out maybe tomorrow or the next day, is that helping get Rhino geometry into Revit. Revit's got I think it's an old ACES modeler. So it can be pretty picky about geometry, especially inside families. And we have a whole bunch of ability to massage the geometry coming out of Rhino so that it gets into Revit and it doesn't mesh. It actually becomes a B-rep. And that's a new build that we're just currently been releasing last week, but we have a new update, which is pretty cool, coming out next couple of days. So those are two things that have just come out and we've currently been working on. And then Ehsan has.
Yeah. So if you install and take a look at the Rhino inside Revit, all the components that we have in the Revit tab, you'll notice that we have a lot more query and analysis components that we have as compared to create components, as we like to call them. Components that let you create native Revit content inside Revit documents. We have plenty, but there's still a lot of work to be done in that department. Part of the reason is that getting stuff inside Revit model and make them sort of like in a way that the Grasshopper can drive them, and it is intuitive for the user, so they can tell the Grasshopper, hey, it's okay. I can take care of this piece of content from now on. And also, when another instance of Grasshopper opens in somebody else's machine somewhere else, it can recognize that piece of geometry, that piece of model that is Revit native is not something that sort of like Grasshopper itself creates. It asks Revit to create that. So that has been always a challenge. We're calling this feature element binding, the way Grasshopper remembers the content that it creates. This feature is sort of like we are in the testing phase of it, so we should be able to publish this out soon. And once this feature is inside Grasshopper, then we will be able to sort of like focus on a lot of create components, because now we have this element binding as a backend, and it would be also accessible to all these scripted components that we have. So if you generate stuff inside Rhino inside Revit, the scripted components that you have will remember all the content that they created, so they can replace them. This ties back to another question that showed up, is that, hey, if you run the Grasshopper definition, does it delete or update the existing component that it created? It really depends on what kind of workflow and what kind of Revit element you're dealing with. The default action is that it's going to delete and replace it with something else. But in a lot of cases, like for example, if you change the property of an element, it's not going to delete the element. It's going to modify the property. So you can easily adjust the height of a series of walls without really deleting them or affecting anything that's posted on it. A couple of these examples are sort of like this, like maybe the base curve of the wall can be replaced without actually deleting the wall. This update sort of like option is heavily dependent on what Revit API actually allows us to do. A lot of content in Revit can be created, but they can't really be updated after they're being created, other than properties. So in a lot of instances, you kind of have to delete it and recreate it. But if you kind of follow that advice that, hey, put all the relationship logic and the material and stuff and the components and elements that you want to generate inside the Grasshopper definition, then there shouldn't be any problems. Like every time you run your Grasshopper definition, you get a new instance of that content. And we have a couple of really good components inside the Grasshopper that are specifically built for this. Scott, do you mind showing them the trigger component that's sort of like new to Grasshopper? So this trigger component that I think inside utilities, this one. This component, you can actually tie it to any other component in Grasshopper, and it specifically works very well with Rhino inside the Revit aware components. So it kind of ties the actual function of that component to that play button that's there. So you can do a whole lot of like calculations and geometry modeling and stuff like that inside your Grasshopper definition. Check it out in Grasshopper, make sure it's good, and then hit the play and let the rest of the definition take care of that, sort of like building all that stuff inside your Revit model. So you can sort of like very nicely separate these two pieces from each other, or have like multiple pieces even inside your Grasshopper definition. So it's sort of like, you don't have to have Revit as a bottleneck all the time, because it's going to take more time for Revit to generate the stuff. You can easily play with them a lot faster in Rhino and just click on it when you're ready.
Yeah, and so in my case, in these demonstrations, what I do is I might take the Revit component and disable it, and then when I'm ready, I'll just enable it, and it'll generate the Revit objects. And so you can do it that way too. But this trigger is pretty nice because you can wire it up to as many components as you want, and you can trigger them all at the same time. So.
One other question that I have, especially because we have a lot of Dynamo users like myself on the call. And I feel like that's actually, I feel like when I ask that question, especially to computational users, it's actually the exact opposite, right? They started in Grasshopper and migrated to Dynamo. Mm-hmm. So any tips that you have for us Dynamo users that want to learn Grasshopper, that, maybe some direct translations that would help? I'm going to share some links that I know for, the Grasshopper manual, of course. I'll share that link in the chat, but anything else would be wonderful as well.
Yeah, so I'd recommend jumping in with both feet. And, and so let's look at the Discover page. I guess the first thing to understand is that the guides here are broken down in a very obviously Revit-like way. And so it's a good place to start, depending on how you want to approach things, because this is mostly written by Ehsan. And so you're going to find a lot of these things here are going to make a lot of sense to you from just a Revit point of view, maybe not as much of a Dynamo point of view. But if we go to Discover here, this manual, of course, is 200, a great way to learn Dynamo too, 200 examples that include both, on one page it's Revit or Dynamo example, and on the opposite page, facing page, is a Grasshopper example of the same thing. And so it's not only a great way to learn Dynamo and Grasshopper, but it's also a great way to kind of see how they in some ways they parallel each other, and where they parallel each other exactly, and where, like you'll find some definitions, it's a little bit more complicated in Dynamo than it was in Grasshopper, or vice versa. And so that's one place to look. Here's a example where Marcelo and Jeff were talking about the two, and they actually, I think Jeff runs a Dynamo definition and Marcelo does a Grasshopper definition, and so they're going back and forth. This is a very good one to get started with right here. So those would be two places for specific Dynamo combinations. Now, I guess we can talk about where Dynamo, the thing that makes Grasshopper pretty special is that it has Rhino geometry kernel in behind it. So if it's a heavy duty geometry thing, or you're changing the geometry of something, that's where Grasshopper is really, really good, because we can use Rhino's geometry kernel in the background to change the geometry on the fly. And so that's where looking at what problems trying to solve and trying to decide if you're going to use Dynamo or Grasshopper, there's a number of people that are trying to kind of get their head around that. That's a really good way to do it. There's a lot more. Dynamo has a lot more components in it, and especially when you get off into sheets and schedules and views and all those kinds of things that you do. Grasshopper, we don't have a lot of those kind of components, but and then the plugins for Grasshopper, you can bring those into Revit now. I saw some questions about Ladybug and Honeybee. Those work in Rhino, and they work in Grasshopper, and they work in Rhino.Inside.Revit. And some people, what they do is they're actually using Grasshopper, for instance, to take the Revit model and simplify it on the fly into grasshopper or into honeybee and ladybug, so that you can ask for the analytical model from Revit, and Revit will hand that to Grasshopper, and then Grasshopper can hand that to Ladybug on the fly, for instance. But you can imagine that's like a geometry thing. We're kind of dumbing down the geometry and simplifying the geometry in order to get it ready for analysis, for instance. Does that help?
One other thing that I wanted to add is that, like, as a Dynamo user coming into Grasshopper, for the first time, if you look at the Grasshopper and sort of like all the ecosystem of add-ons and extensions that's available for it, it might feel a little bit daunting at first. That, hey, like, there's so many different options for me, but Grasshopper is super easy to learn. It's very intuitive. You have access to pretty much anything that you want to do inside Grasshopper. Somebody has already made an add-on for it. One of the nicest things about this transition is that in Dynamo, the core Dynamo sort of like features and stuff like that doesn't have a lot of components that deal with Revit. So you kind of depend on a lot of the add-ons and extensions that other people have created for Dynamo. That makes your definitions dependent on the sort of like packages that need to be installed on the different Dynamo distributions to be able to open your definition. Almost anything that you see right now in Rhino inside Revit that's Revit related comes shipped with Rhino inside Revit. As a great example, all the material components that we have. And there's like some of these stuff we don't have, I guess, as many components as all the Dynamo extensions that add-ons have created for Dynamo, but the ones that are inside Grasshopper, in a lot of cases, I would argue that they actually work better and they have a lot more features to them, like the material components that I mentioned. You can pretty much do, and you can do pretty much anything that you want to do with materials with these components. They're pretty powerful. And sort of like the rest of the create components are also coming. Like that tab that Scott is showing, it's all material components. It only supports the generic right now, but we're testing this with the users to make sure that the workflows are comfortable. And then we'll add all the advanced shaders that Revit has supported as well in them very quickly too.
So one of the crazy workflows that we've been working on is so you can take bitmaps and you can take colors and lists of colors and you can generate material libraries through Grasshopper in Revit. And because you can run because Grasshopper has plugins for V-Ray, you can actually generate V-Ray materials, and you could actually generate them both at the same time, so they're synced up. So you'd have Revit materials and you have V-Ray materials that match each other to as much as they can between the two. So you can actually grab materials out of Revit, or you can generate new materials on the fly, and you can mess around with their color and the bitmap assets they use and things like that. So all through. The embarrassing part here is we actually in Grasshopper now have better coverage of Revit materials than we do of Rhino materials. So
well, looks like we have about a minute left. Do you guys have any final thoughts you want to share with the group before we head out?
Maybe just the forums, Scott, if you want to sort of like share.
Yeah. So the thing that's really, really important about all this is that this is all driven by your requests. So as you try it, please get back to us, because it's the only way we really move forward with this. If you come to the forums here, I'm on here, and Ehsan's on here, and Kike, who's another developer for us on RhinoInsideRevit, we're all on here. Please jump out here and give us the feedback. We can, Ehsan many times can whip up some really quick Python components to help out your problem in the short run, and then we can get them more officially in the product if we need to later. So highly recommend come to our website, get it downloaded, and please participate on the forum, because it's really critical to helping us, meaning you and us, get this product to be right for what you need.